The crowd fell silent the moment the massive Percheron stepped into the arena, not with cheers, not with admiration, but with laughter. The giant gray horse moved slowly, almost lazily, his hooves dragging slightly through the dirt as if the competition meant nothing to him. Some spectators leaned over the rails, whispering and pointing. Others openly mocked. "That one? He won't last a minute," someone shouted. Even the announcer hesitated when reading the entry list, his voice lowering as if he already knew how this would end. But standing beside the enormous horse was a man who refused to laugh. Daniel Hayes tightened his grip on the lead rope, his weathered hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from memories. Years ago, Daniel had been one of the most respected draft horse trainers in 3 states. His teams had dominated pulling competitions, breaking records and winning championships. But after a devastating barn fire took nearly every horse he had raised, Daniel disappeared from the circuit. People whispered that the loss had broken him. Some said he had lost his touch. Others claimed he simply gave up. What nobody expected was that Daniel would return with a horse everyone else had already given up on. The Percheron's name was Titan, though the stable workers had cruelly nicknamed him Drifter. Titan had been passed between owners for nearly 4 years. Each trainer described him the same way: too slow, too stubborn, too uninterested in work. Several farms had tried to use him for logging and hauling, but Titan would often stop mid-task, staring into the distance as if lost in his own world. Eventually, he was listed for auction at a price barely above slaughter value. That's where Daniel found him. The first time Daniel saw Titan, the horse stood alone in a dusty holding pen, his massive frame covered in dull patches of gray, his mane tangled, his eyes distant and tired. Buyers walked past him without a second glance. But Daniel didn't see a failure. He saw something haunting, something familiar. The quiet strength buried beneath Titan's stillness reminded Daniel of the horses he had lost in the fire, horses that had trusted him completely. Without hesitation, Daniel spent the last of his savings to buy Titan. People at the auction shook their heads. One old competitor even pulled Daniel aside and warned him, "That horse will bury what's left of your reputation." But Daniel only smiled and whispered, "Or maybe he'll rebuild it." Training Titan, however, proved far more difficult than Daniel expected. The first weeks were frustrating beyond belief. Titan refused to respond to basic commands. When asked to pull light training sleds, he would plant his hooves into the ground like stone pillars. Some days he wouldn't move at all, no matter how gently or firmly Daniel urged him forward. Yet Daniel noticed something others never had. Titan wasn't lazy. He was afraid. Late one evening, as golden sunset lights stretched across Daniel's small ranch, Titan suddenly panicked when a metal gate slammed in the wind. The horse bolted backward, nearly snapping the lead rope, his eyes wide with terror. Daniel realized then that Titan wasn't resisting work. He was reacting to something deeper, something buried in memory. Over time, Daniel learned that Titan had once been forced into extreme pulling as a young horse, pushed far beyond his physical limits by impatient handlers. The trauma had carved hesitation into his instincts. Instead of forcing Titan harder, Daniel changed everything. He stopped using traditional competition training. He began working with Titan in open fields, allowing the horse to move freely, speaking to him constantly in a calm, low voice. Daniel spent hours simply walking beside him, brushing his coat, feeding him by hand, rebuilding trust piece by piece. Slowly, Titan's dull eyes began to soften. His movements became more confident. His once tangled mane grew thick and glossy as his health returned. But progress remained painfully slow. Months passed, and Titan still struggled to pull even moderate weight. Ranch neighbors began stopping by, pretending to offer encouragement while clearly doubting Daniel's judgment. Some suggested selling the horse before Daniel lost everything. Others quietly laughed, convinced the former champion trainer had lost his instincts along with his barn. Then came the letter. The Tri-State Draft Pole Championship was returning after a 2-year hiatus, promising the largest prize purse in regional history. Daniel stared at the invitation for hours, knowing what it meant. Entering would put him back in front of every competitor who believed he had failed, and Titan would be standing beside him. Daniel hesitated for days. Entering meant risking public humiliation. But one cold morning, as he prepared feed, Titan approached him without being called. The massive horse lowered his head and gently nudged Daniel's shoulder. A small gesture, but one Titan had never shown before. In that moment, Daniel made his decision. They would compete. The weeks leading to the championship were filled with tension. Daniel slowly introduced heavier loads, carefully watching Titan's body language. At first, the horse resisted, his muscles tightening, his breathing quickening. But Daniel never forced him. Instead, he paused, spoke softly, and waited. And something extraordinary began to happen. Titan started pulling, not out of command, but out of trust. By competition day, Titan had successfully dragged weights heavier than anything Daniel initially thought possible. Still, entering the championship meant facing elite draft teams trained for years in professional circuits. And now, standing in the arena entrance, Daniel could hear the crowd laughing again as Titan stepped forward under the blinding stadium lights. The massive weight sled loomed behind them, its iron runners digging into the dirt like anchors. The announcer cleared his throat, barely masking skepticism as he introduced the pair. Returning competitor Daniel Hayes, and his percheron, Titan. A few scattered claps echoed, mostly out of courtesy. Daniel adjusted the leather harness across Titan's shoulders, feeling the enormous muscles shift beneath the horse's coat. He leaned close, resting his forehead briefly against Titan's neck. "You don't owe them anything," Daniel whispered. "Just walk with me." Across the arena, the judges signaled the starting line. The first weight was considered manageable, an opening round designed to test basic strength and endurance. But Titan hesitated, his hooves pressing into the dirt as murmurs spread through the audience. Cameras zoomed in, capturing every twitch of uncertainty in the horse's stance. Daniel felt his heart pounding, the same crushing fear he had felt the night of the fire flooding back into his chest. For a brief moment, doubt crept in. Had he misjudged Titan? Had he mistaken trauma for hidden strength? The whistle blew. Titan didn't move. The crowd erupted into laughter once more, voices echoing through the stadium. Daniel closed his eyes, gripping the lead rope gently, refusing to pull. Seconds passed like hours. Then unexpectedly, Titan lowered his head, exhaled deeply, and took one slow, deliberate step forward. The sled groaned against the dirt. Another step followed. And suddenly, the laughter stopped. The entire arena leaned forward as Titan took his third step, the iron sled scraping loudly behind him. The sound cut through the stadium like a thunderclap. The laughter that had filled the air only moments earlier faded into stunned silence. Titan's massive shoulders flexed beneath the leather harness, every muscle rippling as dust rose around his hooves. Daniel walked beside him slowly, refusing to rush, refusing to panic. He knew one wrong signal could shatter the fragile confidence they had built. The opening weight wasn't the heaviest in the competition, but it was far from easy. Several seasoned teams earlier in the day had struggled to complete the full pull distance. Yet Titan moved with an odd rhythm, slow but steady, as if every step had been carefully measured before touching the ground. His breathing remained deep and controlled. His ears flicked back occasionally, listening for Daniel's voice, his entire focus locked onto the man walking beside him. By the halfway marker, whispers began spreading across the stands. Spectators who had been laughing minutes ago now stood, gripping the railings. Even the announcer's tone shifted, his voice rising with growing disbelief. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is unexpected." Titan crossed the finish marker with a final heavy step, dragging the sled completely across the line. For a moment, there was nothing but stunned silence. Then scattered clapping began. Not loud, not overwhelming, but respectful. Daniel gently removed tension from the lead rope, placing a calming hand against Titan's neck. The horse lowered his head slightly, snorting dust into the air, as if the performance meant nothing to him. But Daniel's chest tightened with emotion. That single pull had already proven something no one believed possible. Still, the real test hadn't even begun. As the first round ended, Daniel led Titan toward the resting enclosure. Around them, competitors prepared their teams for the next weight increase. That's when Daniel noticed a familiar figure approaching from across the holding area. Marcus Varnell. Marcus was everything Daniel once had been, younger, confident, and currently the reigning champion across 3 states. His team of Belgian draft horses had dominated competitions for years. Marcus stopped a few feet away, folding his arms as he studied Titan carefully. "You've always liked impossible projects," Marcus said, his tone neutral but edged with challenge. Daniel didn't respond immediately. He continued brushing dust from Titan's shoulder, checking the harness straps carefully. Marcus smirked slightly. "One decent pull doesn't make him championship material. The next round doubles the weight." Daniel finally looked up. "I know." Marcus stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You lost everything once already. Don't lose your last chance trying to prove a point." For a brief moment, Daniel felt anger flicker in his chest. but he pushed it down. Marcus wasn't entirely wrong. The upcoming rounds would test Titan's limits, physically and emotionally. One bad experience could destroy the trust they had built. Titan shifted beside Daniel, nudging his shoulder again, as if sensing the tension between the two men. Marcus noticed and raised an eyebrow. "He trusts you," he admitted quietly. "That might be the only reason he's still out there." With that, Marcus turned and walked away, leaving Daniel alone with the echo of his warning. The second round began 30 minutes later. The weight sled was now stacked with massive iron blocks, the load nearly twice the opening round. Several teams before them failed to complete the full distance, their horses straining, slipping, and stopping halfway across the arena. The pressure inside the stadium thickened with every failed attempt. When Titan's turn approached, Daniel felt his pulse racing again. He checked every strap twice, running his hands slowly across Titan's mane. The horse's muscles twitched beneath his touch, but his breathing remained steady. The stadium lights reflected off Titan's gray coat, giving him an almost ghost-like glow under the night sky. As they stepped onto the arena floor, the crowd reacted differently this time. There was no laughter, only tension. The announcer's voice rang out again, now filled with cautious excitement. Returning for the second round, Daniel, Hayes, and Titan. The whistle echoed sharply. Titan froze. The sled's chains clinked softly as he planted his hooves into the dirt. Daniel felt the hesitation ripple through the horse's body. The weight behind them was far heavier than anything Titan had faced in front of a crowd. The noise, the lights, the pressure, it all pressed down like an invisible storm. Daniel leaned closer, speaking softly, almost whispering directly into Titan's ear. "It's just us. Same as the field." One step. Seconds dragged by. The audience shifted restlessly. Cameras zoomed in again, capturing every moment of uncertainty. Daniel could hear murmurs beginning to return in the stands. Doubt was spreading again. Then Titan's ears flicked forward. He inhaled deeply, lowering his massive head toward the dirt. Slowly, deliberately, he leaned into the harness. The chains tightened. The sled jerked once, barely moving. A gasp rippled through the stadium. Titan pushed harder. His hooves dug trenches into the dirt, muscles surging beneath his coat like rolling waves. The sled groaned, sliding forward inch by inch. Dust exploded behind him as he forced the iron weight across the arena floor. By the quarter mark, Titan's breathing grew heavier. Daniel could feel the strain building. He matched Titan's pace perfectly, never pulling, never forcing, only guiding. The crowd rose to their feet, their cheers building with each step. At the halfway marker, Titan stumbled. The sled jerked violently, nearly stopping completely. Daniel's heart slammed against his ribs. One wrong moment here could cause panic, could reopen old trauma. Titan's legs trembled under the weight. For a terrifying second, it looked like he might collapse. Daniel immediately stepped closer, placing both hands against Titan's neck. "Easy, you're not alone," he whispered. The words weren't commands. They were reassurance. Titan snorted sharply, shaking dust from his mane. His ears locked onto Daniel's voice. Then, with a sudden surge of strength, he pushed forward again. The sled lurched violently, sliding farther than anyone expected. Gasps turned into roaring cheers as Titan crossed the final distance marker. The stadium exploded. Spectators leapt from their seats, shouting and clapping. Even rival trainers stood in stunned disbelief. Titan had just completed a pull that eliminated nearly half the competition field. Daniel staggered slightly as he removed the harness tension, overwhelmed by adrenaline and emotion. He pressed his forehead against Titan's shoulder again, his voice barely audible beneath the crowd's roar. "You did it, you actually did it." But as Daniel stepped back, he noticed something that made his stomach tighten with fear. Titan's legs were shaking. The massive horse stood tall, but subtle tremors ran through his muscles. Sweat darkened his gray coat, and his breathing had grown deeper, more strained than before. The physical toll of the second round had been enormous. And the third round would be worse. The arena lights burned brighter than ever as workers stacked the final iron blocks onto the third round sled. Each clang of metal echoed like a warning bell through the stadium. The scoreboard flashed the updated weight, just over 8 tons. Only 2 teams earlier in the night had even managed to move it beyond the starting line, and neither had completed the full distance. The atmosphere shifted from excitement to pure tension. Daniel stood beside Titan in the preparation lane, running his hand slowly along the horse's trembling shoulder. The massive Percheron had calmed slightly after resting, but the exhaustion was undeniable. Sweat had dried into streaks across his gray coat, and faint muscle spasms flickered beneath his skin. Daniel's chest tightened as he watched. Memories of the barn fire surged back without warning. The helplessness, the smoke, the screams of horses he couldn't save. The fear of pushing another horse beyond safety wrapped around his thoughts like barbed wire. He had promised himself he would never let ambition outweigh compassion again. A stadium official approached, clipboard in hand. "You're up in 2 minutes," he said. Daniel nodded silently. As the official walked away, Marcus stepped forward again, his boots crunching against the gravel floor. This time, his expression was serious, almost respectful. "You've already proven everyone wrong," Marcus said quietly. "You don't have to risk him." Daniel exhaled slowly. "I'm not risking him." Marcus glanced at Titan, who stood quietly listening, his ears flicking between both men. "You sure about that?" Daniel hesitated. The question cut deeper than Marcus intended. Before he could answer, Titan lowered his head and pressed his muzzle gently into Daniel's chest, a gesture so sudden and intimate it stole Daniel's breath. The massive horse stood perfectly still, as if grounding him, reminding him of something unspoken. Marcus watched the moment carefully, then stepped back. "Whatever happens out there," he said, "that horse trusts you more than any team I've ever seen. Don't forget that." With that, Marcus walked away toward his own team, leaving Daniel alone with the weight of the decision. The gate to the arena opened. The roar of the crowd poured inside like a tidal wave of sound. Titan lifted his head, nostrils flaring as he stepped forward beside Daniel. The massive sled waited in the center of the arena, chained and immovable, its iron runners partially buried into the dirt from previous failed attempts. The announcer's voice boomed across the stadium. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you are about to witness may become one of the most talked about polls in Tri-State Championship history. Daniel Hayes and Titan are attempting the third round weight, over 8 tons. A hush fell across the stands. Daniel adjusted the leather harness slowly, checking each buckle with shaking fingers. He leaned against Titan's neck briefly, closing his eyes. "You stop if it hurts," he whispered. "No records, no trophies, are worth losing you." Titan exhaled deeply, his breath fogging the cool night air. Daniel stepped forward to the starting line, gripping the lead rope loosely, refusing to place pressure on it. The judge raised his arm. The whistle shrieked. Titan didn't hesitate this time. He leaned forward instantly, muscles surging beneath the harness as the chains snapped tight. The sled jerked violently but barely moved. Titan dug his hooves deep into the dirt, pushing with explosive force. Dust erupted around him as his massive frame strained against the impossible load. The sled slid forward a few inches. The crowd gasped. Titan pushed again, slower this time, every step a visible battle. His neck stretched low, shoulders rolling with terrifying power. Daniel walked beside him, whispering constant reassurance, matching Titan's pace exactly. Every step felt heavier than the last. At the quarter distance, Titan's breathing deepened into heavy bursts. Foam began forming around his bit, and sweat dripped from his mane. The sled dragged stubbornly behind him, its iron weight clawing into the dirt. Then, suddenly, Titan faltered. His front leg buckled slightly, sending a ripple of fear through Daniel's chest. The sled slammed into the ground, halting their progress. The stadium fell into absolute silence. Titan's legs trembled violently, his entire body shaking under the crushing load. Daniel immediately stepped in front of him, placing both hands against Titan's face. "Stop if you need to," Daniel said softly, his voice cracking. "You've already done more than enough." Titan's dark eyes locked onto Daniel's. For a long moment, neither moved. The crowd watched, barely breathing. Cameras zoomed in on the emotional stillness between man and horse. Then Titan did something no one expected. He nudged Daniel backward gently, almost insistently. It wasn't panic. It wasn't resistance. It was determination. The massive Percheron inhaled deeply, lowering his head once more. His ears pressed forward, his muscles tightening like coiled steel. With a powerful surge, Titan pushed forward again, dragging the sled with renewed strength that seemed to defy logic. The sled lurched forward violently, sliding nearly 2 feet in a single burst. The stadium erupted into thunderous cheers. Daniel stumbled beside him, tears burning in his eyes as he struggled to keep pace. Titan continued, step by agonizing step, each movement fueled by raw willpower and something far deeper, the bond they had built through months of patience and trust. They reached the halfway marker. Only one other team all night had crossed that point. Titan's legs shook harder now. Every muscle in his body trembled under the crushing pressure. Daniel could see exhaustion carving into his movements. The distance remaining suddenly looked endless. Across the arena, Marcus watched with clenched fists, whispering under his breath as if willing Titan forward. Titan took another step. Then another. The sled screamed across the dirt, metal grinding against earth like a storm. The crowd chanted rhythmically, their voices blending into a single deafening wave of support. With only a few feet remaining, Titan's back legs slipped slightly in the churned dirt. The sled slammed to a stop again. Titan staggered, barely staying upright. Daniel immediately reached for him, his heart shattering at the sight of the giant horse trembling uncontrollably. "You're done," Daniel whispered, tears finally spilling down his face. "You don't have to prove anything else." For a terrifying second, it looked like Titan might collapse. Then, slowly, the Percheron steadied himself. He lifted his head one final time, locking eyes with Daniel again. And with the last reserve of strength hidden deep inside his enormous frame, Titan lunged forward with a single, unstoppable surge. The sled crossed the finish marker. The arena exploded into absolute chaos. Spectators screamed, jumped, and pounded the railings. Judges stared in disbelief. Several trainers removed their hats in silent respect. The impossible had just happened. Titan had completed the 8-ton pull. But Daniel wasn't celebrating. Titan stood trembling violently, his legs barely holding his massive weight. His breathing had turned ragged, his chest heaving with exhaustion. Daniel rushed to him instantly, throwing his arms around Titan's neck, whispering calming words as veterinarians sprinted across the arena. The championship round announcement echoed through the stadium like distant thunder, sending a ripple of anticipation across the massive crowd. Workers moved with urgent precision, stacking the final iron blocks onto the grand championship sled. Each metal slab landed with a crushing clang that seemed heavier than the last. The scoreboard flickered, updating the final weight, 10 tons. No horse had successfully completed a full pull at this weight in the Tri-State Championship for nearly a decade. Back in the recovery enclosure, Titan stood surrounded by veterinarians, handlers, and officials. Bright portable lights illuminated every movement as they monitored his breathing and checked his legs repeatedly. Daniel stood just outside the circle, his hands clenched tightly at his sides, his chest still rising and falling unevenly from the emotional storm of the third round. Titan lowered his head, his massive frame visibly drained. Sweat still darkened patches of his coat, and every breath sounded heavier than the last. Daniel stepped closer, resting his palm gently against Titan's cheek. The Percheron leaned slightly into the touch, his dark eyes still calm, still locked on Daniel with that same unwavering trust. The lead veterinarian approached Daniel with a serious expression. "Physically, he can attempt the final round," she said carefully. "But he is extremely fatigued. One wrong movement, one muscle failure, and he could suffer permanent injury." Daniel swallowed hard. The words struck deeper than any warning Marcus had given earlier. He looked toward the arena entrance where roaring cheers continued to build as spectators realized the championship round was approaching. Titan had already become the unexpected hero of the night. Walking away now would protect him, but it would end their run just short of the ultimate test. Marcus approached again, this time without competition in his eyes. His Belgian team had completed a strong third-round performance but had fallen short of Titan's distance. For the first time, Marcus spoke not as a rival, but as someone who understood the stakes. "You've already won something bigger than a trophy," Marcus said quietly. "You brought him back from fear. You brought yourself back too." Daniel stared at Titan, memories swirling through his mind. The auction pen, the months of slow training, the countless nights wondering if he had made the wrong decision. He had promised Titan he would never push him beyond safety. That promise echoed louder than the crowd outside. Daniel stepped closer, pressing his forehead against Titan's neck. "We're done if you're done," he whispered. "This ends when you say it ends." Titan stood still for several seconds, breathing deeply. Then he did something unexpected. He straightened his posture, lifting his head high, his ears pressing forward toward the arena entrance. His muscles tightened slightly, not with panic, but with focus. Daniel felt it instantly, that quiet, powerful decision Titan was making. Officials called their names from the arena entrance. Final championship pull, Daniel Hayes and Titan. The stadium erupted into deafening cheers as Daniel slowly led Titan toward the arena floor. The atmosphere felt electric, charged with anticipation and disbelief. Spectators stood shoulder to shoulder, cameras raised. capturing what might become one of the greatest moments in draft pulling history. The championship sled sat in the center of the arena like an immovable mountain. 10 tons of iron and steel rested on runners carved deep into the dirt. Even veteran trainers stared at it with hesitation. Daniel carefully fitted the final harness across Titan's shoulders, his hands shaking more than ever before. He paused, running his fingers through Titan's thick mane, memorizing the warmth beneath his touch as if fearing this might be their last moment together in the ring. "You owe me nothing," Daniel whispered again. The judge raised his arm. The stadium fell silent. The whistle screamed. Titan stepped forward instantly. The chains snapped tight with explosive force. The sled jolted violently but barely moved. Titan dug deep, his hooves carving trenches into the dirt. The massive Percheron lowered his head, pushing with every ounce of strength left inside him. The sled slid forward, inches at first, then a full foot. The crowd erupted into thunderous applause, the sound rolling through the stadium like a storm. Titan continued, each step slower than the last. His breathing turned into harsh bursts of air. Foam streaked down his chest, and sweat sprayed from his mane with every movement. Daniel walked beside him, whispering continuously, his voice raw with emotion. They reached the quarter marker. No horse had passed that point yet in the championship round. The crowd sensed history unfolding and began chanting Titan's name in a thunderous rhythm. The sound echoed off the stadium walls, vibrating through the dirt beneath their feet. But Titan's legs began shaking again, far worse than before. His back leg slipped slightly, causing the sled to slam forward with terrifying force. Daniel's heart nearly stopped. Titan staggered, barely catching himself before collapsing. Daniel immediately reached for him, his voice breaking. "That's enough. You've done more than anyone ever expected." For a terrifying moment, Titan's body trembled uncontrollably. His chest heaved, nostrils flaring as exhaustion clawed at him. The crowd fell into absolute silence again, thousands of people holding their breath as they watched the giant horse struggle to remain standing. Daniel placed both hands against Titan's face, his tears falling freely now. "You don't have to do this," he whispered. Titan's eyes met his. And once again, the Percheron made his own decision. He nudged Daniel gently aside, lowering his head with fierce determination. With a powerful, almost desperate surge, Titan pushed forward again. The sled jerked violently, sliding farther across the arena floor. Gasps turned into screams of disbelief as Titan crossed the halfway marker. The impossible was happening again. Daniel stumbled beside him, nearly overwhelmed by emotion and exhaustion. Titan's legs shook violently with every step now. Each movement looked like it could be his last. Yet the giant horse kept pushing, driven by something far deeper than competition. Across the arena, Marcus removed his hat, pressing it against his chest in silent respect. Only 10 feet remained. Titan's back legs collapsed slightly before catching again. The sled slammed into the dirt, halting completely. Titan stood frozen, trembling so violently that dust shook from his coat. Daniel rushed in front of him again, gripping his harness, desperation flooding his voice. "We're done. You hear me? You're done." Titan stood motionless. The entire stadium remained silent, waiting. Seconds stretched into eternity. Then Titan lifted his head one final time, locking eyes with Daniel. The moment felt almost human, filled with understanding, trust, and something unspoken between them. With a deep, thunderous exhale, Titan leaned forward for one last surge. The sled screamed across the dirt. 5 feet. 3 feet. One final explosive step. The sled crossed the championship marker. The stadium detonated into the loudest roar of the night. People screamed, cried, and pounded the railings in absolute disbelief. Judges stood frozen, unable to process what they had just witnessed. Titan had completed a 10-ton championship pull, something many believed physically impossible. The stadium lights still blazed behind them as Daniel walked beside Titan into the quiet recovery corridor, but the deafening cheers of the crowd had faded into a distant echo. Inside the medical bay, the atmosphere shifted from explosive celebration to careful, urgent calm. Veterinarians and handlers moved quickly but gently, guiding Titan into a padded recovery stall designed for exhausted competition horses. Titan's massive legs trembled as he stepped forward, each movement slower than the last. Daniel never left his side, one hand resting firmly against the Percheron's neck, whispering softly as if his voice alone could keep Titan standing. The giant horse lowered himself carefully into the deep bedding, releasing a long, heavy breath that seemed to carry the weight of the entire night. The lead veterinarian began a full examination, checking muscle tension, hydration levels, and joint stability. Daniel stood silently nearby, his heart still pounding with lingering fear. Every second felt fragile, as if one wrong sign could shatter everything they had fought for. Minutes passed. Finally, the veterinarian turned toward Daniel with a small but reassuring smile. "He's severely exhausted, but he's going to recover," she said. "You did something extraordinary tonight, and so did he. But he'll need time. A lot of time." Daniel nodded slowly, emotion swelling in his chest as he leaned against the stall railing. Titan turned his head slightly, resting his muzzle against Daniel's arm, his breathing now slow and steady. That simple gesture broke whatever emotional strength Daniel had left. Tears streamed down his face as he pressed his forehead gently against Titan's. "You scared me," he whispered, his voice trembling. Outside, reporters and competition officials gathered, waiting for updates. The news spread rapidly across the stadium and beyond. Social media feeds exploded with videos of Titan's final pull. Headlines formed within minutes, calling the moment one of the greatest draft horse performances ever recorded. But inside the quiet medical stall, none of that mattered to Daniel. For him, the victory had already happened the moment Titan survived. Later that evening, championship officials approached Daniel with the grand trophy, a towering silver monument engraved with the Tri-State Championship crest. Camera flashes lit the corridor as they presented it to him. The crowd outside roared once more when Daniel stepped briefly into view. But instead of raising the trophy above his head, Daniel turned and placed it gently beside Titan's stall. "He earned it," Daniel said simply. The moment spread across media outlets within hours, capturing hearts far beyond the draft-pulling world. People weren't just talking about strength anymore. They were talking about loyalty, patience, and trust. Over the following weeks, Titan became something of a legend. Videos of his championship pull reached millions of viewers. Messages poured into Daniel's ranch from around the country, letters from young riders, retired trainers, and horse lovers who saw something deeply emotional in Titan's story. Many shared how the story inspired them to rebuild trust with animals they once thought impossible to train. But Daniel quietly stepped away from competition circuits. Instead, he focused entirely on Titan's recovery. Each morning began with slow rehabilitation walks across the ranch fields. At first, Titan moved cautiously, his muscles still healing from the extreme strain. Daniel never rushed him. He walked beside him patiently, speaking softly, rewarding every small step of progress. Weeks turned into months. Titan's strength gradually returned, but something inside Daniel had changed. The desire to chase championships had faded. What replaced it was a deeper purpose, helping misunderstood and traumatized horses find trust again, just as Titan had found it with him. Word spread about Daniel's new training approach. Owners began bringing horses considered untrainable or dangerous. Many had suffered harsh handling or emotional trauma. Daniel worked with them slowly, often spending weeks simply earning their comfort before asking anything from them physically. Titan became the quiet center of it all. The massive Percheron often stood nearby during training sessions, calm and steady, almost as if teaching the frightened horses by example. His presence alone seemed to settle anxious animals. Visitors to the ranch often described him as peaceful, almost knowing. One crisp autumn morning, nearly a year after the championship, Daniel stood at the ranch fence watching Titan graze freely across the open pasture. The giant horse moved with quiet strength, his gray coat glowing under the golden sunrise. Marcus arrived that day, stepping out of his truck with a small grin. "I heard you turned your ranch into a rehabilitation center," Marcus said as he leaned against the fence beside Daniel. Daniel smiled faintly. "Turns out broken trust heals slower than broken bones, but it heals stronger." Marcus nodded, watching Titan trot slowly across the field, his mane catching the morning light. "You know, people still talk about that pull," he said. "Some call it the greatest strength performance they've ever seen." Daniel shook his head gently. "It wasn't strength," he replied. "It was choice." Marcus studied him curiously. "He chose to trust me," Daniel continued. "That's harder than pulling 10 tons. Marcus smiled quietly, understanding more than words could explain. That same year, the Tri-State Championship Committee unveiled a permanent honor, a bronze statue placed at the arena entrance. It depicted a massive Percheron leaning forward in a pulling harness, with a trainer walking calmly beside him. Beneath it, an inscription read, "True strength is built on trust." Visitors often stopped to take photos, but many simply stood silently, reflecting on the story behind it. Back at the ranch, Titan never returned to competitive pulling. Instead, he spent his days roaming open pastures, assisting in training sessions, and quietly greeting visitors who traveled miles just to see the legendary percheron. Children especially seemed drawn to him, often standing in awe beside his towering frame while Titan lowered his head gently to meet them at eye level. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Daniel sat on the pasture fence watching Titan graze peacefully nearby. The air carried the quiet sounds of wind brushing through tall grass. For the first time in years, Daniel felt completely at peace. Titan lifted his head suddenly and walked toward him, stopping just inches away. He lowered his massive muzzle onto Daniel's shoulder, the same gesture that had begun their championship journey. Daniel smiled, running his hand through Titan's thick mane. "You saved me too," he whispered. Titan snorted softly, nudging him again as if acknowledging the truth between them. And as the camera of this story slowly pulls back, capturing the golden pasture, the quiet ranch, and the silhouette of a man standing beside the horse who changed his life, it reminds us of something powerful. Sometimes the strongest victories aren't measured in trophies or records, but in trust rebuilt, fears overcome, and bonds that no weight in the world could ever break. If Titan's story moved you, inspired you, or reminded you of the incredible connection between humans and animals, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because stories like this deserve to be remembered, and there are many more waiting to be told.